Hello, Linked HR, and happy week. I'm Dr. Chris Wildermuth, your community chair for One More Flesh Learning. So this weekend, I had the privilege of running a personality, specifically a Big Five personality certification for some of my students at Drake University and some of our alumni. And we had a blast. We had a wonderful day. I'm very passionate about personality. And because I'm so passionate about personality, I'm also passionate about appropriate uses and inappropriate uses of personality. So what I wanted to talk today was the idea that personality is more complex than we often think it is, and that when we try to overly simplify personality, especially when we use overly simple assessments at work, we could do more harm than good. You can read more details in the blog that I wrote, but I just wanted to give you the highlights in this quick flash learning. The first thing that you should consider is that you can't, personality trait does not completely explain personality. In other words, personality is more than just trait tendencies. What do I mean by trait tendencies? For example, I have the tendency to be an extrovert. You must have noticed that by my films. I smile a lot, I'm talkative, I'm sociable, I feel comfortable in a room with lots of people. People give me a lot of energy. So I have the tendency to be an extrovert, right? But my personality is more than just the fact that I'm an extrovert. There are other layers to that. And the work of the fascinating work of a psychologist called Dan McAdams, again, if you go to the blog, you'll see the link to his book. What Dr. McAdams says is that there are layers to personality, starting with the traits, extroversion, whether you get nervous or not, or your tendency, your tolerance to stress would be another trait tendency. Another tendency is agreeableness, or how easy it is for you to focus on people's needs, etc. So there are, according to the Big Five model, there are 5 major traits that compose our personality tendencies. But on top of that, there are what Dr. McAdams calls characteristic adaptations, which includes our values, our motivations, our dreams, our hopes, and the developmental moment that we're in. So, for example, with age, there are some values or motivations that change. I'm more interested, for example, now on my legacy or how can I help people than maybe I was when I was in my early 20s. So those values and goals and motivations in the stage you're in life also impact how you behave. And finally, Dr. McAdams talks about what he calls the life stories, which he describes as your major identity or your overall identity. The example that I like to give people is that the life stories is kind of like, imagine if you had somebody in Hollywood create a film about your life and some actor, actress were playing your part, your role. How would you like that film to be? What film would you like people to see? What reputation would you like to have? And that film that you see, that overall identity, also impacts your overall personality. In other words, personality is not only about traits. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. Second thing that I wanted to say is that even if we look only at the traits, you can't look at traits in isolation. For example, yes, I'm an extrovert, but I also tend to be somewhat low in agreeableness. And what that actually means, and my colleagues, my peers, if any of my bosses is listening to this, they would probably heartily agree, is that I tend to be a challenger. I tend to challenge the status quo. But a challenger, or somebody who is low in agreeableness and very assertive, that person is going to show up very differently if she is also an extrovert than if she is an introvert. One more tendency, to give you another concrete example. I tend to get angry easily, but I'm also very tactful. Well, a person who gets angry easily but is also tactful is going to show up differently than a person who gets angry easily but is very direct to the point. I tell it like it is. So you see how it's kind of like a recipe, and you cannot look at only one trait in isolation. So to recap, you can't look only at traits because there are also values and motivations and goals and so on. And you can't look at traits in isolation, even if you're looking at traits. Third piece, what about types? So I know that many people use type instruments. I myself have used type instruments in the past. And sometimes type instruments can be a nice shortcut, a simple shortcut for you to deal with personality. I'm not going to go too hard on types versus traits because people have their preferences and I have a clear bias towards the trait instrument, so I don't want to go too hard on it. But here's one thing that I will go too hard on it. Do not use type instruments for personnel selection. So if you use them for team building, for understanding, for so on, that's still not what I would personally choose, but at least there you're unlikely to do harm and it can give people a shortcut. So why am I saying do not use type instruments for selection? Well, for a very simple reason. Intuitively, you probably know already that there are more than 4 types of people in the world if you're using one of those 4-box instruments, or 16 types if the instrument allows for that combination, or even more types, like I don't know how many types your type instrument uses. But however many types your instrument uses, it's probably not around 3,000, which is the number that you would get if you got the 5 major traits, or the so-called Big Five, which is the model of personality that most personality researchers use these days. If you do 5 to the power of 5, you get about 3,000 types or 3,000 different combinations. I sincerely doubt that's what your instrument provides you, because if your instrument provided you with 3,000 types, it would not be terribly useful as a shortcut. What's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is that you're mistyping most people. And if you're mistyping most people just as a shortcut, and you are very clear in your training and your interpretation, and as you help people understand their results, that, hey, this is not exactly you. If there are things here that don't apply to you, just cross them out. In other words, if it's well taught, probably not much harm done. But if you're using those types to decide whether people can be hired or not for a position, you're denying somebody the opportunity to work at your organization, and you're denying your organization the talent of that person for what could very well be an inaccurate result. So there I will go hard. In other applications of personality, I have my preference. I very clearly prefer the Big Five model. I've talked about the Big Five model before. If you go to my blog, there are links where you can get more information about the Big Five model, but I'm not going to go as far as to say type instruments cannot be used, because that wouldn't be true. They can be useful under certain conditions. So those are the things that I wanted to talk to you today in terms of personality complexity. Just to recap, remember that you should be looking at combinations of traits because people show up differently depending on where they are. Remember there are different routes to get to the same place, that there's more to personality than just the traits. And remember not to use type instruments for selection. That's as far as I wanted to go today. Please do go to the blog, because this was a fairly complex message that I wanted to share today, and I wrote much more than I'm able to say in a brief recording. Happy learning, everyone, and have a wonderful week.